Hello. I hope this story will make think and stay with us until the very end. Your support, comments, and subscriptions are very important to us. John sat in his favorite chair, looking at the cracked bricks of the fireplace. He had spent his entire life in this house, raising his children, experiencing joy and loss. Now, at the end of his life, the house has become not only a refuge, but also a part of his soul. One day, the door opened and his son Mark walked into the room with a twinkle in his eye and bubbling energy. "Dad, I need your help," he began. John felt anxious, but tried to smiling. "Of course, son. What's wrong?" Mark explained that he was working on an idea that would change the world. It's a startup that will help automate logistics for small businesses. He spoke enthusiastically about presentations, investors, and opportunities. But it takes money to get it going, Mark added, avoiding direct eye contact. John raised his eyebrows. "What kind of money?" Mark began to lay out his plans. They could sell the family home. It would be enough money to start a business and even buy a small place for John. John realized that he risked losing the place that meant everything to him. But shouldn't he support his son? Isn't this what I've been working for all my life?" he thought. At night, lying in his bedroom, John looked at the photos on the wall, his wife, children, grandchildren. He remembered how he built this house with his own hands, how his wife planted roses in the garden. "Am I doing the right thing?" he asked himself. The next morning, John invited Mark to the kitchen. "All right, son. I'll help you," he said, his voice trembling. "But you have to promise me that you'll do your best to make it work." Mark, happy and grateful, hugged his father. "You won't regret it, Dad." A few weeks later, the house was sold. John packed up, looking through boxes of old letters and albums. Each item was filled with memories, and each lost thing felt like a wound. John moved into a small rented apartment, was cramped and cold, but he convinced himself that it was temporary. "It's all for Mark, for his dream," he thought. After selling the house, John tried to get used to the new reality. His new apartment was small, without character, and the walls seemed soulless, but he kept reminding himself that he did it for Mark. Mark, in turn, was the center of attention. His startup seemed promising: presentations, meetings with potential investors, an office in a modern neighborhood. Everything looked good, but John couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. John Jong, a retired man who had worked as an engineer all his life. Hardworking kind, but a bit naive when it comes to his children. His main weakness is his desire to do everything for his family, even if it means sacrificing his own comfort. Mark, John's son, 35 years old. Energetic, ambitious, but a bit irresponsible. He dreams of success and believes that his startup will be a breakthrough. Katie, John's younger daughter, who has always been more practical and reserved. She works as an accountant and was against the idea of selling the house from the very beginning. Robert, John's trusted friend and neighbor from the previous house. Robert has always been skeptical and bluntly told John that the decision to sell the house could be a disaster. One day, John met Kathy for a cup of coffee. "Dad, did you really believe this was a good idea?" "Look in you," she asked, looking at him with a mixture of pity and indignation. "Mark promised me it was only temporary," John replied, trying to defend his son. "His idea has potential." Katie sighed. "I'm just afraid he doesn't realize how big a risk you took." These words stuck in John's head. That evening, he began to analyze the last calls from Mark. It seemed that his son was avoiding talking about finances. John decided to meet with Robert, who invited him to his home. "I warned you, John," Robert said as he handed him a cup of tea. "I know it's hard to admit, but you're putting too much trust in Mark." "He's my son, Robert," John replied. "I couldn't say no to him." Robert shook his head. "Trust is good, but it has to be justified. You sold the house you've lived in all your life, and now what? You don't even know where the money is going." As Mark's business grew, John began to notice strange changes in his son's behavior. Mark used to call him every day to update him on the progress and seek his advice. Now the calls were shorter and the conversations were superficial. But one evening, John decided to ask Mark directly. "How are you, son?" You look tired. I'm fine, Dad, Mark replied, quickly changing the subject. Just a lot of work. But there was something fake in his son's voice. John began to feel that he was not being told everything. Several months had passed since John sold the house and handed the money to Mark. At first, everything seemed to be going well. Mark and his team opened a small office, launched an advertising campaign, and even got their first clients. But John noticed that his son looked more and more tense and withdrawn. One evening, Mark drove his car to John's house. Instead of his usual enthusiasm, he sounded tired. How are you, son? John asked, pouring tea. I'm fine, Mark answered quickly, but avoided making eye contact. John noticed that Mark was talking less about his business. He used to talk proudly about new contracts and meetings, but now his answers were short and general. One day, when Mark was visiting John, his phone rang. Mark quickly went out to the balcony and spoke in a muffled voice. John heard only fragments. I know, but it's going to take some time. I know, I'll find the money. Just give me a few more weeks. When Mark came back, John decided not to ask direct, but his anxiety grew. John shared his concerns with Kathy, who had long suspected that Mark might be in trouble. Dad, you need to know the truth, she said. I checked Mark's company financials. They've been in the red for months. John shook his head, but how? He said everything was fine. Kathy put her hand on his shoulder. Maybe he's afraid to tell you he made a mistake. John decided to come to Mark's office to see for himself. When he walked in, he saw empty desks, several employees who looked worried, and Mark himself on the phone trying to convince someone. Dad, what are you doing here? Mark asked when he saw his father. I just wanted to see how things were going, John answered. Mark tried to smile, but John could see that his son was tense. As John was leaving the office, he was approached by one of Mark's former employees. Are you his father? He asked. Yes, John replied, cautiously. You should know that the company is close to bankruptcy. He's laid off half the team, but he doesn't want to admit it. John felt his heart clench. He couldn't believe Mark was keeping this from him. John returned home from his visit to Mark's office, but his mind was restless. The words of his former employee haunted him. He decided to find out the truth, even if it would be painful. The next day, John invited Mark to dinner. He prepared his son's favorite foods, hoping that this would help him relax and be honest. Mark, how are things going? John began, trying to sound calm. Everything's fine, Dad, Mark replied, but his eyes darted away. I was in your office yesterday, John said, not looking away. Mark froze for a moment. Dad, I can explain everything. I'm listening, John replied shortly. Mark sighed and finally began to speak. The company is facing problems, Dad. We've lost some big clients, and I'm trying to find investors to pay off the debts. John was stunned. Why didn't you tell me this before? I didn't want to worry you, Mark replied. You've already done so much for me, and you didn't think I'd notice. John's voice rose. You took the money I gave to help you, and you couldn't even be honest with me. After talking to Mark, John called Kathy to share what he had learned. Dad, it's worse than you think, she said. What do you mean? I checked Mark's company's credit report. Not only are they in debt, but they took out another loan using your money as collateral. John felt his legs give out. He couldn't believe that Mark had gotten this far without consulting him. John decided to consult Robert, who always had a sober view of the situation. You have to ask yourself, John, if you can continue to trust Mark. Robert said, he's your son, but that doesn't give him the right to treat you like this. I just wanted to help him, John replied, shaking his head. And you did, but now he has to take responsibility for his actions. Robert said firmly. John realized that he could no longer stand by. He decided to go through Mark's financial records to find out how deep the problems were. He invited Mark to his home and setting. I want to see all the reports of your company. If you want me to continue to support you, you have to be honest with me. Mark hesitated, but eventually agreed. John sat at the kitchen table, holding the financial documents Mark had provided. He studied each page, his heart racing with anxiety. All his fears were confirmed. Mark's company was in critical condition. The next morning, John called Mark and asked him to come over. There was something in his voice that made Mark come over immediately. "Dad, what's wrong?" Mark asked as he entered the room. John silently showed him the papers. What is it, Mark?" he asked calmly but coldly. Mark looked down. "These are company reports, Dad." They're reports on how you're not only destroying your dream but my life?" John's voice grew louder. "You took everything I had and didn't even consult me when you took more risks." Dad, I didn't want you to worry," Mark began. "I thought I could fix it." Fix it?" John asked sarcastically. "You couldn't even admit that you lost." I just wanted to make you proud of me," Mark replied, tears welling up in his eyes. "How can I be proud of someone who betrayed my trust?" Mark, trying to defend himself, began to accuse John. You never understood what it was like to try to build something of your own. You always thought your methods were the best." John looked at his son in shock. "I sold my house, Mark. I did it not for myself, but for you. How could you do this to me?" Mark lowered his head. I don't know what to say," he said quietly. John took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "Tell me honestly, Mark, do you have a plan to save the company?" Mark shook his head slowly. "I thought I could find investors, but no one wants to invest." "Then you have to admit to yourself that it's over," John said. "You have to take responsibility for your actions." John's words hit Mark harder than he expected. He realized that there was no point in lying any longer. Dad, I made a mistake. I thought I could do something great, but instead I ruined everything." John looked at his son carefully. "Recognizing your mistake is the first step, but now you have to fix it." After a difficult conversation with Mark, John felt exhausted. His life seemed to be in ruins. His house was sold, his savings were lost, and his trust in his son was shaken. Yet he knew he had to move on. On the next morning, John decided to take a walk in the park to calm his nerves. There he met Robert, his neighbor and longtime friend. John, you look as if the whole world has fallen on your shoulders," Robert said, sitting down on a bench next to him. It is," John sighed. "I lost everything to help Mark, and now he doesn't even know how to get out of this situation." Robert listened attentively as John told his story. I've made mistakes like this before," Robert finally said, "but you're not alone in this." Robert offered to help John, and I know a business consultant. He specializes in debt restructuring. Maybe he can do something for Mark. John looked at his friend in surprise. Robert, are you really willing to help? We're friends, John, and friends support each other." Robert smiled. A few days later, John and Mark met with the consultant Robert had recommended, Mr. Anderson. He was a middle-aged man with an attentive gaze and a calm voice. "Let's start by analyzing the situation," Mr. Anderson suggested. Mark began to lay out the numbers, and John watched the consultant's reaction. Surprisingly, Mr. Anderson didn't look scared. "This isn't the worst I've seen," he said, "but we need to act fast." Mr. Anderson developed a plan: sell unnecessary company assets to cover some of the debt, attract new customers through special offers, ask creditors to defer payments. "It will be difficult, but it is possible," he concluded. John looked at Mark. "Are you ready to work to fix this?" Mark nodded. "Yes, Dad. I'm ready." After the meeting, John went back to the park to thank Robert. I don't even know how to thank you," he said. Just don't give up, John," Robert replied. "We all make mistakes, but it's how we handle them that counts." John sat in a small room with Mark and Mr. Anderson. The previous days had been filled with stress, uncertainty, and tension. Behind the plan they had developed was starting to show some results, but the problems still seemed insurmountable. Mr. Anderson suddenly turned to John. "And we have one more option. You can sell the rest of your assets to provide the final coverage of your debts. This will greatly accelerate the company's recovery." John froze. "What exactly do I have to sell?" "Your pension," Anderson replied. Mark immediately intervened. "No, that's impossible. I've already hurt Dad too much." But John remained silent. His mind was racing. John went outside to clear his head. He was thinking about everything that had happened: the sale of his house, the loss of stability, the betrayal of trust, and now another choice that could leave him with no means of support at all. His heart was torn between love for his son and fear for his own future. At that moment, Robert came over. "Is something wrong?" he asked. John shared Anderson's proposal. Robert listened intently and then asked Egg, "Are you really ready to give up everything for Mark?" "Emma, I don't know," John answered honestly, "but can I live with myself for not doing everything I could to help him?" John looked at Mark as he walked back into the room. "Son, I'm willing to risk my pension, but this is the last time I can help." Mark began to protest. Dad, this is wrong. I have to fix this myself." "This isn't just your test, Mark," John said. "It's a test for both of us." Mark could not hold back his tears. For the first time in all this time, he realized how great his father's love and sacrifice were. "Oh, Dad, I promise I won't let you down. I believe you," John said quietly. A few months passed. John was sitting on an old bench near the park where he loved to spend time. His life had changed a lot since those dramatic events, but he felt that he was now on the cusp of something new. With the help of Anderson's plan, Mark managed to stabilize his business. He began to make his first profits and even recovered some of the money his father had lost. But it wasn't enough to fully restore John's financial situation. John did not regret his decision. He saw his son changing, becoming more responsible and confident. One evening, Mark arrived at the trailer where John was living. "Dad, I know I've caused you a lot of pain," he began, "but I want you to know that I won't stop until I get you back everything you've lost." John smiled. "Son, I'm glad you're on the right path. No, but remember that true wealth is not money, but the way you live and the lessons you learn." Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. It was Robert. He was holding a folder of documents. To John, "I thought you might be interested in this," he said, handing it over. John opened the folder and saw a job offer. Robert had arranged for a small position at the local library, a place where John had always enjoyed spending time. "It's not much, but it's a good start," Robert explained. John agreed. He started working at the library, interacting with patrons, helping with book selection, and organizing literary events. This work brought him not only income but also moral satisfaction. Mark, for his part, started a charity project to help other entrepreneurs avoid the mistakes he had made. He often mentioned in his speeches the lessons he learned from his father. One day, John sat down on the same park bench again. He watched the children playing, the people walking along the alleys. His life was far from what he had imagined, but he felt peace in his heart. Life is not always about what you lose, he thought, but about what you gain. Will John ever be fully restored financially? And will Mark be able to fulfill his promise? The answers remain open, but one thing is clear: there is always room for a new beginning in life. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more stories like this.